Welcome everybody to this month's meeting of the Advisory Council. I'm just going to go over the meeting guidelines quickly. All participants will join this meeting with muted microphones. If you could rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and affiliation, that would be great. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this by clicking on the participants button at the bottom of your screen. A window will pop up and there will be a raise hand button at the bottom. If you do not see it, then try clicking on the three dots and it may be located in there. The presenters will then call on participants. If you are on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand, and you can press *6 to mute and unmute yourself. We do ask that if you are not speaking, just to keep your microphone muted in the meantime to try to cut down on background noise. And if you're having any technical difficulties, you can contact me, that's Matt Archer, via the chat box at marcher@ctps.org or by calling 857-702-3708. And with Scott, I will pass it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, welcome. And I just want to start with going through some introductions. So I'll start out. My name is Scott Zadakis. I'm the vice chair of RTAC, and I work at Transaction Associates on the National Regional Transit Assistance Program, Rural Transit Assistance Program. So I'll just kind of go through as I see you in order on my screen. So the next would be Sandy.
Thanks, Scott. Sandy Johnston. I work for CTPS, the staff to the Boston Region MPO. I manage the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, and do a variety of other things. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you all in just a few moments.
Okay. Skashi.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Seth Kashi. I'm senior engineer with GPI. Thank you.
Laura.
Hi, I'm Laura Wiener, and I work in the Watertown Planning Department.
Thank you. John.
John Seward, Move Mass.
Other John McQueen. Thank you, John Seward.
John McQueen, Walk Boston.
Marilyn. Looks like we might be having some technical difficulties there. We can come back to you if you get that working. Matt Genova.
Thanks, Scott. Hey, everyone. Matt Genova, the Boston Region MPO. I manage the Transportation Improvement Program. And just like Sandy, I'm excited to talk with you all here shortly.
Looks like Marilyn's unmuted if you want to say hi.
Yeah, hi.
Let's see, Anna Christina.
Me?
I think you're good.
Okay. Anna Christina Fregoso. I'm here for.
Oh, Anna seems like she's breaking up a little bit there.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just came off a bunch of meetings where today all of a sudden they say I'm breaking up. Sorry. Sorry
Okay,
about that.
No worries. Andy.
Hello, my name is Andy Rieker. I work for the City of Cambridge in the Community Development Department. I'm a transit planner, and I also assist in project managing for a bunch of different projects around the city. Good to see you all.
Fred.
Oh, there we go. Fred Mosley, I'm representing the American Council of Engineering Companies, okay. ACEC.
And you all met Matt, but Matt, I don't remember if you actually said what your title was.
I didn't. Matt Archer with CTPS, Transportation Planner, and the RTAC Coordinator, among other things. Nice to see you all.
Okay. Leonard, I should have let you go right after me probably as the chair of the organization, but please go ahead.
That's quite all right, Scott, because I really feel more like
co-chair, meaning the chair is kind of a technical designation, me, but I'm also I'm here on RTAC as a member of the MBTA Rider Oversight Committee.
And Stephen?
Yes, hi, Steve Wading with the Mass DOT Aeronautics Division.
And Todd?
Todd Corain, Transportation Administrator for the town of Brookline.
And there's a phone number here. I'm told it might be Barry, but I'm not sure. But whoever's on the phone, if you could identify yourself.
Barry Steinberg, Association for Public Transportation.
Great. So now that we're all acquainted, let's just jump right into it here. I guess the first thing on the agenda is Sandy is going to be talking about the Unified Planning Work Program and trying to get some study ideas from all of us on what we might like to see studied in the 2022 work program.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It is great to be back. This is always a very productive conversation when I come to visit with the Advisory Council for study ideas. So I did just put a flyer in the chat, a link to the UPWP flyer that Kate White put together in the chat. It's great, and I encourage you all to refer to it while I'm talking. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what the UPWP is and what it does, and then we can have a discussion about what kinds of study ideas you'd like to see included in this year's universe of proposed studies, which I will get to in a moment. So the Unified Planning Work Program, or UPWP, is the process and the resulting document that decides how the MPO will spend the pot of money it gets from the federal government each year to perform transportation planning work and technical assistance. A subcommittee of the MPO board guides development of the UPWP each year. Most of the money in this pot goes to perform the core functions of this or any MPO, such as administering the Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP, the Long Range Transportation Plan, the Transportation Equity Program, the Congestion Management Process, the Travel Demand Model, and all those kinds of things. But there's a certain amount of money each year that ends up being left over for carrying out studies and technical assistance, and kind of generating ideas for those activities is the most important reason that I want to chat with you all today. A couple different categories within that overall category. So discrete studies are what we call the larger one-time analyses that staff take on each year. These can cover a variety of topics, from coming up with conceptual improvements to a roadway corridor, to resilience, to transit planning, to long-range and strategic planning. In recent years, the UPWP committee has typically indicated that it wants these large-scale studies to be targeted on topics of regional or sub-regional interest rather than being targeted at one community. And anyone can submit an idea for one of those studies. It's a very informal process. You just have to let me know. CTPS also maintains 2 technical assistance programs, which are typically aimed at smaller projects. We're talking the scale of 1 bus route, 1 intersection, that kind of thing. One of them is called the Community Transportation Technical Assistance Program, which looks at roadway improvements, complete streets, bicycle and pedestrian issues. And then there's the Regional Transit Service Planning Program, which helps with what you'd expect, regional transit service planning. Those programs are open to municipal governments. The transit planning one is open to transportation management associations and to regional transit authorities. If any of you who are not part of one of those bodies want to submit an idea for a technical assistance project, I'd be happy to work with you to put you in touch with the correct people in the municipal government or another entity as well. One thing to be aware of with regard to the technical assistance projects is that MAPC, our partner agency, also maintains a number of technical assistance programs, and the Community Transportation Technical Assistance Program in particular is shared between CTPS and MAPC, so you will hear about it from both ends. So a study or technical assistance project by MPO staff can ultimately lead into a project to be implemented through the TIP process, although the designs that staff provide with these projects are more conceptual than really being advanced enough to begin the TIP process. But really not everything that we're looking for has to be project-based. We're also looking for study ideas that can lead into thinking about regional best practices related to transportation, what data we should gather, the vision for the future of the region. Ultimately, the analyses that we do through the UPWP will help to shape the next long-range transportation plan, how the MPO updates its goals and objectives, and all kinds of other kind of like grand strategic topics. So the question I'm bringing to you today is, toss out your ideas. What should we study? What data would it be useful for us to generate? How can we provide information that's helpful to you? What do we need to look at and think about to lay the groundwork for the future of the region's transportation network? Just in terms of timing, I'll be gathering and processing ideas for the next month to 6 weeks, and then staff and the UPWP committee will be working together to start winnowing down the field and narrowing it down into a list that we can end up funding in January and February. And that is a process that Len has been enthusiastically part of many times. So I'm sure he can help me answer any questions that come up. But yeah, at this point, I would like to just kind of throw it open to anybody who would like to throw some ideas out there, and feel free to submit them in the chat, or Scott can call on folks. You can also reach me later at sjohnston@ctps.org, which I will also put in the chat. But we are recording this conversation, so I will be able to make sure that I catch all of the ideas that people put out there later.
Great. Thanks, Sandy. So anybody that's got any ideas, this is your time to throw them out there.
Well, the best part I was thinking about not being the chair of this meeting is that I get to raise my hand, but I can't because I'm the co-host. So I'm going to wait a little bit, and if no one raises their hand, then I'll suggest some things.
Scott, do you want to call on people, or do you want me to?
Yeah, you can go ahead and do that if you want.
Sure. Andy, I see you have your hand up.
Sounds good. Thank you. So one of the things that I think is clearly on many people's minds is economic recovery after the pandemic. And I'm wondering, not necessarily in terms of what it may mean for how the transportation system functions, but I'm wondering if there's any topics that would be really helpful for us as a region to consider as we kind of, hopefully, given some of the news coming out in the past week or so about vaccinations and potential for, the COVID-19 pandemic restrictions to be eased, how that plays into how cities, municipalities, and other transportation planning organizations should think about our streets or other aspects of the transportation network. So it's not a very concrete idea, but that's one of the things that we've been trying to process in the city of Cambridge as much as we can, while still acknowledging that, we don't have a lot of clarity, although we have a lot of hope. And so, that's just a general topic area that I would love to see if there's any ideas that could be really helpful out of the UPWP processes, how we deal with now the economic kind of aspects that we're going to have to deal with in the coming year or two. So not anything specific, but just a general topic area.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think you won't be surprised to hear that we're hearing that from a lot of people as an area of uncertainty. And one thing that I should, I think, clarify that I didn't mention in my initial presentation is right now we're looking for ideas for federal fiscal year 2022, which begins in October of 2021. So until then, we still have almost a year, right? And we do have a couple of studies in the federal fiscal year 2021 UPWP that are currently active that are going to be touching on that question of economic recovery. One of them is our future of the curb phase 2, which is looking at curb access and how different needs for access to curb space, parking, delivery, bike lanes, that kind of thing may be balanced in the future. And the other one is going to be our access to commercial business districts, which is also a phase 2 study. And that is, we did an earlier version of it a couple of years ago. And that one is really going to be focusing heavily on COVID recovery as a topic and trying to figure out what the needs of people in those commercial business districts are. So certainly we will continue with the COVID focus next year, COVID recovery focus next year, I'm sure, as well. But I just want to kind of throw out there that these things are already on our radar for this current year as well.
Yeah, and I just wanted to maybe add a little bit to that since I'm kind of from the transit world, but something I'd like to see a little bit. It's a big thing to get your arms around, but it's just how mass transit, both public and private, has been affected, and how demand has been affected, and whether it's coming back and things like that. That's something that I think would be appropriate even a year from now, or more than a year from now. So.
Some kind of ongoing data monitoring effort, because I think people have a pretty good idea of like what the MBTA ridership looks like. They're doing a good job tracking that. But for the smaller operators, the small RTAs or TMAs or shuttle programs, nobody that I know of is kind of collecting and bringing all of that information to be visible in one place.
Yeah.
All right, I think Anna Christina had her hand up. You should be able to unmute yourself. There you go. Hey.
My computer is a mess.
Can hear you now, I think.
You can hear me?
Yes. I think you muted yourself again, Anna Christina.
There we go.
Okay.
Scott just mentioned, but more, or can you do like a study of what you think faces, like how we're going to phase that back? We get the
Anna Christina, we might do better putting that in the chat or something. I'm not getting a lot of it, at least on my end.
All right.
I was going to suggest, you're breaking up a bit, so if you could put it in the chat, we'll come back to you in a minute.
And maybe if she should, maybe you should shut off her video. It'll be a little more. It might be helpful, or reboot. Thanks.
All right. Anna Christina, we'll come back to you in a moment. If you can put it in the chat, or if you can see about your computer. I see David Montgomery.
Hi, Sandy. Can you hear me all right?
Yep.
This is probably a little out of the norm, and I'm not sure if it can be forced into the UPWP bucket or not. But an issue that sort of has been on my mind for many years now is that we seem to regularly, we in the broadest sense, seem to regularly reinvent the wheel when it comes to thinking through transit and transportation matters. And I was curious as to whether there's any way to simplify the accessibility of the research that the MPOs all over the country are doing, such that I can remember regularly it's frequent for a component of the research to be, well, we review the literature, but as we sit here brainstorming about what might we like to see you do, I wonder what has already been done, not just within the Boston MPO, but in other MPOs. And then more recently, our town, along with everybody else, was asked to comment on what we thought of the Forge Ahead plan, and we had similar reservations or concerns about how do we measure a return of demand when we're just one little township. What do we know? How are we going to have that kind of data crunching? And one of the useful data points for us was somebody in our group was intimately aware of some stuff that was going on in Chicago, and it was comparable data that we could share. But I'm wondering if our own MPO can become a little bit more of a gateway to some of that other data. And even if you can't force it through the UPWP, I'd love to know the answer to that as a general matter. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you. I have to say, I personally love that idea. I do think that in managing the flow of information is a really critical piece of this, and that I share your feeling that we often do reinvent the world, both the wheel, both at CTPS and in other transportation planning entities. I think I would love to see that in the universe of proposed studies, and I will put it in there. I imagine that rather than becoming a study, it's something that might get integrated into other CTPS priorities in terms of making it somebody's job to kind of figure out how to ease that flow of information. And maybe we can have a conversation about how creating a portal on the website or sharing a portal with other agencies to make that information more accessible to municipalities, as well as leveraging all of the contacts that people on staff and MPO members have in terms of sharing that information. I mean, you mentioned you'd been in touch with somebody from Chicago, and my family's in Chicago. I follow transportation stuff in Chicago quite avidly, and I do have contacts there and in other places, and I think trying to create a lot more of that flow of information could be really positive. So, all right, I think Laura Weiner, you were next.
I just wanted to throw another idea into the bucket of COVID recovery that Andy and Scott started. I am concerned that once we get the all clear and people start going back to work, that everybody's going to be driving alone in their cars again. And especially if, as they say, some people are going to continue to work from home, so there won't be quite as much congestion, which is the biggest disincentive to drive your car alone. So maybe best practices or any ideas. I mean, I don't think that's a study in and of itself, but could be a question.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, if we want to continue to achieve goals about mode shift and having people not traveling by car in an environment where there's less congestion and a bunch of people just bought cars during the pandemic and got used to driving, that's going to be something that's going to require robust planning practice and public policy. And so what are the things that you can use to achieve those goals?
Right. Is congestion the only thing that that keeps people from, that incentivizes people not to drive? Or maybe there's other things.
Charging for parking and not having as much parking available. I just finished working on a UPWP study last year about trip generation analysis, which I interviewed Laura for the rest of you. And one of the major things that came out of that was that parking is one of the key policy elements to leverage in one direction or another.
Mm-hmm. Very good. You already did the study.
I'm sure there's more to look into.
Thank you.
All right, John McQueen.
Hi, Sandy. To again, part of that point, Laura and everybody's raising about the pre-post COVID, I guess one of the factors you can't really, work without is the MBTA. If we're trying to figure out congestion, is there going to be congestion, drivers, things like that. And I guess that might come to the transit part. Was it T2? The not trip generation, the access to the business district.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, it might come into there, or the future of the curb. Is overall movement, let's say, going to be toward a central business district? Is that going to fall off, or is it just going to come back and people are going to be driving because they can't get transit? Right. There are just so many unknown variables, at least for now, until the vaccine gets out there and has a chance to set in. I know my son's company that's in Cambridge, they're planning to go back to work in their offices in July, but that's just tentative. So there's a lot of that. One other aspect, I guess, in some of these is can you apply not just what's happening in some of those contexts, but can you also try and apply policies that we want to go to? For instance, mode share, which goes out the window again with the COVID, but instead of what's going to happen, try and steer it, a little bit in terms of how the policies might impact that, or where we want to go?
Yeah. No, these are very relevant concerns. Obviously, the MBTA is something we've heard a lot about, and questions about how people are going to get places and what happens if people are accustomed to traveling somewhere by transit and all of a sudden the level of transit service is not as robust, or is completely eliminated. And how does that play into the whole policy apparatus? These are definitely things that are both short and long-term critical questions that we'll definitely be looking into considering. So I see Anna Christina put something in the chat. She said, I'm wondering if you can't do a study on how to phase out of shared spaces, transit, bikes, cars, trains, etc., as people slowly get vaccinated and we get the all clear. So Anna Christina, to be clear, and you can respond in the chat, are you thinking about what happens when the shared spaces that are currently being implemented are done because the pandemic is over, or are you thinking about how to kind of keep those spaces around as we slowly return to quote unquote normal? So I think while we're waiting for Anna Christina to respond in the chat, I will say that I think the question of these shared spaces that have emerged and is something that's being strongly considered in our Future of the Curb and CBD studies, because it seems to me, as a kind of an outside observer, that the outdoor dining thing is popular and maybe here to stay even after the pandemic, although maybe not in December. But what happens if, first of all, how do we think about repurposing parking spaces for that kind of a thing, parklets, outdoor dining? And second, how do you ensure that we can do that without poorly affecting other transportation options like bike lanes, or in many cases, there have been issues with sidewalks being obstructed, especially for folks with disabilities and that kind of thing. So Anna Christina says both, and also protocols for cleaning. Yeah, so definitely kind of looking into whether some of the heightened procedures for cleaning are a good thing to keep going forward. What is going to need to change? I know there's been a lot of talk about ventilation on trains and buses and cleaning of stations, and how that might be, a nice thing to keep around even when there's not a pandemic going. I know personally I prefer buses that have open windows that can be opened so that you can get a little bit of fresh air going. We can definitely see what we can look into in terms of that. All right. So I see one last hand up is Len's, but he wanted to go last. So is there anyone else who has a question or comment or idea before we call on Len?
Just as a quick reminder, folks, you can find the raise hand button by going to the lower portion of your screen and clicking on the participants button, and a window will pop up and there is a raise hand button at the bottom. If you do not see it there, you can click on the 3 dots on the right hand side and it may be located there. And if you're calling in, you can press *9.
Yes, thank you, Matt.
Yep.
I see John again.
Yeah, hi. That last comment raised some good points. Maybe there's a study with more immediate relevance and projection of what aspects of the pandemic behavior, that was forced behavior, let's say, do people really, have they discovered that they really like? Like you said, ventilation, like you said, a lot more cleaning. There's a lot more sensitivity. Is there going to be, even after the pandemic, just a more awareness of people's proximity to each other, and distancing, and hygiene, and just modes? Is there going to be a lasting increase, let's say? I mean, pedestrian walking and biking has gone through the roof.
Yeah.
During this, and how much of that is going to stick as somebody discovered, wow, this isn't all bad. I should have had this bike years ago, or I should get my walking shoes.
Yeah.
and resold, and and start and keep walking and things like that. So I don't know if there's a study of the behavior, related to transportation, but all those things really relate to aspects of transportation.
Definitely. I mean, there's the kind of broad, grand scale stuff like, are people going to continue to work from home several days a week?
Right.
I think the answer for many white collar workers is going to be yes. That seems to be what we're hearing. Then there's things like, it's my understanding that in Japan, it's considered somewhat socially taboo to talk on the train. And I would not be surprised if Andy Reeker has his hand up to tell us that. But that's something that maybe that has been talked about a little bit during the pandemic, but maybe going forward, we can talk about a preference for not talking as much on the train or on the bus. All right, so I think I see Andy and then Marilyn. Andy, you want to go ahead?
I will hard agree on not talking on the train in Japan, and also, to be honest, for me in Boston too. But that's just my personal preference in Boston. It's not a social norm in Boston like it is in Japan. I think one other aspect too, kind of moving beyond the topic of post-pandemic thinking, is I think one of the other things that's come up this year, and I'm not necessarily sure whether this is a UPWP project, is I think the kind of reckoning that we've had with race and ethnicity in the United States. And that's something that, again, in my workplace, we've been having a lot of conversations about. There's in the city of Cambridge, we have a diversity, equity, and inclusion kind of initiative that's going on. And I'm wondering how that affects municipal planning efforts in particular, and how we acknowledge what's happened this past year, in that I think it's become very clear for many people that there's a significant issue of trust in local government that already is so hard on a basic level, but when it comes to specific communities, and in particular around the difference between outreach and engagement. So outreach is in like, I'm going to tell you about a project, it's coming, versus developing relationships with particular communities within our municipalities that have long been underserved or outside of the realm of the decision-making process. And so, how we develop our skills around that, and whether there's something, even if it's just a canvassing of the region of what are some good practices around this topic, I think would be good to be reflective of an understanding that our baselines are going to be changing as we continue into the next few years. I don't think, given the kind of uprisings that have happened, the protests and stuff like that, that we can say that personally, I'm not making a statement as the City of Cambridge employee, but a little bit more on a personal level, I don't think we could say that we didn't see that, right? We didn't see the visceral responses that people had to the killing of George Floyd, for example, the other things that have happened over the course of this summer and this year, and say that, as planners, we can't not acknowledge the situation and how that plays into our work. So, in a different perspective, I think that's one of the other things that this year I feel like hopefully is reflected in UPWP studies in 2022.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, I mean, very eloquent and very powerfully said. And that is, I think you would not be surprised to hear a conversation that we are having internally among staff. And it's a lens that we want to bring to everything we do. But is very much an opportunity to do something very intentional about it. And I really like the idea of kind of having some kind of regional convening to think through these things in a very honest way. So let's definitely be in touch about that. All right, let's go to Marilyn, and then I think we'll go to Len because we're starting to run out of time here. Marilyn, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
I hope I just unmuted myself. Yes, good. So I was interested in, especially in the discussion a little while ago about behavior, because when I look at the documents, a lot has to do with physical infrastructure. But obviously, if you want to anticipate what's going to happen, you have to anticipate people's behavior. And so I go back to a point that I've made before. I'm concerned about bike and pedestrian safety. And I've been very concerned over the years that the licensing and other regulations that apply to internal combustion things, vehicles, cars, trucks, don't apply to bicycles and cyclists. And I believe that it's sort of odd, and now that I think about it, it's the reaction that I've had to ideas of requiring people to wear helmets, requiring the vehicles and the operators to be licensed to pass tests, indicating that they know what the rules of the road are, what the regulations are, and that there be standards for the hardware. You know, no one is interested in that, and it seems to me that the reaction among the biking community has generally been analogous to people's take on wearing masks in the pandemic. It's, in other words, people don't want to be told that they have to wear a helmet when they're riding a bike. This is my daughter's calling in. Sorry. So that concerns me a lot, especially because, you know, over the years, as I look at the money that goes to so-called greenways that are actually, you know, bike and pedestrian paths that are secondary roads, the specifications for them are suitable for cars and small trucks. They are plotted and constructed with what seems eminent disregard for trees, for example, so that the argument about their contribution to dealing with climate change is a little moderated there by the disregard for the damage done to actual green space. So I don't know how that, my concern, could get folded into any of this forward-looking stuff. I've put this in writing before, and I've never seen any response to it. But I was very glad to see that people are trying to anticipate what's it going to be like afterwards. And I anticipate that bicycles are going to be much more important, even more important. And since the incremental expenditure on that hardscape, the paving, has it's funny, in the LRTP or in one of the documents from, say, 2017, the increases in spending for say mass transit or roads or this or that were given in percentages, and for bike paths they were given in actual dollar increases. So there's this kind of protection of bicycling as a means of transportation, but it's not fully equivalent when looked at as other modes are. All right, that's my spiel today.
Yeah, thanks, Marilyn. And you know, I think this question of behavior is and licensing and such is actually something there's a considerable amount of existing research on. And I know we had this conversation over the summer when we amended into the past UPWP the Vision Zero memo. You know, and that we did write a, you know, you raised some of these issues in a comment, and we did send a pretty lengthy response. So I will say that, you know, I'm going to defer some of that conversation to when we present the Vision Zero memo, which I think is going to be in January at the MPO. But just to say that, you know, there is a considerable amount of research out there about this, and a lot of it is crystallized in that memorandum that we did in the FFY 2020 UPWP. All right, so I want to go to Len because then I think we need to move on to the community connections.
Yeah, and I know we're running short on time, so I'm going to keep mine really quick. One of mine tags me, kind of folds in with what David said, but I think David's idea is a really good idea, and that is maybe looking into whether some kind of central repository for all the transportation research done by the MPOs and maybe even other entities. Is whether there is a repository, and if not, then what it would take to create one. Because the idea that I had was if we could start tracking the transportation industry for innovations, like keeping tabs on what is new and what people are thinking about doing. And this is my way of getting back to AVs, because we know that that industry isn't gone. My concern is that there's lots going on in the background, and we're not making policy for it now because, first off, it's not as big a topic as it was a while ago, and because of COVID. But then it'll pop out, and it'll have an implementation that will not be really friendly, I think, towards transit, or at least sharing the mode. So that's one. The other is, and someone has touched on this already, and that is, I'd like to see a study that looks at how much people are walking and how much more they could walk, and the impact of that increased walking on transit or other types of transportation, and how to promote more walking. So essentially, I'd like to see us do a UPWP study about walking. And the last one is a study on these smart cars, the really tiny things that can fit in a bike lane. And you've probably heard me say this several times, that I was really captivated once when I saw one that fit into a bike lane. And I think they could be made even smaller. And if we are becoming a society that, for whatever reason, maybe safety is one that provides a single occupancy vehicle, then it'd be good if that vehicle were really small and had a light footprint. And so I think maybe we could look into those, and maybe how we could facilitate more of those on the roadway, and once again, maybe in if not a connected way, because that may be a ways off, but maybe in a shared way. Because one of the issues now with sustainability is that cars are underutilized. They sit in driveways most of the time. And I think if they were shared and we came up with a model for sharing them, it could make transportation less congested, and also safer, and more importantly, more on demand. Because I think that's a problem with transit, especially longer commutes, is just that, if you have to wait an hour for a train and someone says, but you can just come and go when you want, there's a certain freedom in that. And even if sometimes it takes you a little longer to get there, you prefer that freedom. So I went on for longer than I wanted, but that's it. You don't have to respond, Sandy. These are just ideas, and we can move on, and we'll come back later on. Thanks.
No, thanks, Len. I do have one quick thing to say, which is that, first of all, very interesting ideas as always. But I do think this conversation about vehicle design and the implications that has for safety is something that's really becoming a big deal. And I know Angie Schmidt was one of the keynote speakers at the MassDOT Moving Together conference. And while I have not read her book, it is sitting on my Kindle. She's done a great job pushing the conversation about how a lot of modern car and truck designs are really pretty unsafe for pedestrians. And this question of regulations and vehicle sizing is, I think, an emerging one in the transportation field. So I'd be very interested to take a look at that. All right. So I think, Scott, do you want to move on to the community connections section?
Yeah, sure. So this is also Sandy. But yeah, we're just going to have a little conversation about the pilot year of the Community Connections program, which was a program for some seed funding and other types of funding for smaller projects such as bike pedestrian wayfinding and other things. But I'll let him talk more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And thank you again to everybody for contributing to the UPWP discussion. That was very productive, as it always is. So we're just going to throw a few links in the chat to illustrate this conversation, since I don't have a slide deck for it. So there's the page for the Community Connections program, which is pretty focused on the current round that we're currently soliciting applications for. Matt just added the the memo that I wrote to review the pilot round, which was carried out last year. And then I'm going to grab one more thing, if you'll give me a moment. If you go to, one second, please. I'm going to put one more link in here. Come on, it's not working. All right. There's a PowerPoint presentation I'm about to put in your a link to here. All right, sorry. Starting on page 42 of that last link, there's a listing of the projects that we funded through the Community Connections program last year. But I will start from the beginning, which is that the Community Connections is a spending program within the overall TIP program, the MPO's capital funding program, which is intended to fund first and last mile connections, other small, non-traditional types of projects. Basically, most of our TIP projects are roadway projects. You'll hear more about this from Matt in a moment, or transit, or something on the scale of several millions of dollars at least. And there's been a long-standing desire from the MPO to be able to throw some money at smaller types of projects that are easier to implement and might give really good bang for the buck, and that close gaps in the transportation network. And so using a small amount of the TIP, about 2% each year, the MPO decided to try and fund some of these projects. And last year we ran a pilot round. We selected a list of project concepts that we'd heard about in MPO studies, MAPC studies, or just heard about from project proponents, and invited them to apply to kind of test out the program, see how it's working, see what was actually feasible to do. We learned a lot from that, and probably the most important lesson is that administering these very small projects, moving them from saying, yes, we have the money, to actually getting shovels in the ground, so to speak, is difficult. Most of our institutions are not necessarily very well set up for doing that. And so we have to be very picky about which types of projects we can choose to fund through this program. So if you look at the first of the links that we just threw in the chat there, the Community Connections page, it gives a list of projects that we're offering to fund this year. And that list is kind of a little bit of a grab bag. It's all over the place in terms of transit signal priority and shuttles and a particular kind of sign that the MBTA has been putting at bus stops. And that's all because those are all things that have like a viable path to implementation. What we'd really like to do with this program in the long run is maybe create a slightly more coherent list of types of projects, but this is what's feasible at the moment given what our partner agencies are able to do. And we've really been able, one thing we're very grateful for is being able to leverage the collective purchasing program that MAPC runs, because they have a list of vendors they work with that are pre-qualified for using federal funds, and all MAPC member municipalities, which were of course also MPO member municipalities, are eligible to use those vendors, and it's just much easier. It streamlines everything. So basically, I just wanted to kind of report back and say that there were some disappointments from the pilot round. One of them was that we're not going to be able to fund things like sidewalk improvements or bike lanes through this program at this moment in time. That is obviously something we'd like to get in there in the long run. But unfortunately, anything that touches the ground basically becomes a lot more difficult. And so right now we have landed on a list that we're pretty happy with. We've simplified the scoring, which I think is going to work a little bit more nicely. And we are in the middle of our first open call for projects through this program. The deadline is on Friday. And my impression is that it's going to be quite competitive, which is nice. Obviously, it would always be nice to have more money to give out, but it's good to know that there's demand out there for this kind of project. So really, I'm happy to answer any kind of questions that anybody may have. I see John.
You mentioned the MAPC collective purchasing program that's available for that. Would equipment like I think we have some in my town, equipment for snow and ice removal for the public sidewalks, or they could be used for the multi-use paths too. Is that would that be something that could come under that? Obviously, it would make connections within the community much more accessible in those kinds of conditions.
Yeah, so I don't think they can do that currently. I just put a link in the chat, and they kind of have very specific categories for things that they can
Yeah.
do. I will say that's something I am personally passionate about. I would love to see more
Yeah.
professionalized and efficient snow clearance, and I think it fits into the first and last mile theme of this program in the long run.
Right.
So if you want to suggest it to MAPC, I'll write a letter of support.
Okay, I just wondered if it was available, if the funds would be available for something like that, but they're not.
Not currently, no.
Great, thanks.
All right, Len?
So you said that one of the disappointments was that one of the reasons causes for the disappointment was that there was a lot of overhead associated with these projects, right?
Yes, basically, especially on behalf of MassDOT's highway division, that they, the administrative burden that these small projects is placed on them is very much out of proportion to the size of the projects.
Right, right. I mean, so I guess what I'm hearing is that it just costs a lot in overhead because what I'm getting at, it doesn't really matter what the ratio is, right? I understand it to a certain extent. And I'm just going to use a bad analogy. Like if it takes you, 10 times as long to walk to some place as you're going to spend there, the time you're going to spend there, you're going to feel, wow, that didn't make sense. But if, the point is, you just needed to get there. To get something, it doesn't really matter in the sense to me. So what I'm getting at is, if the project is worth doing, even if the percentage of overhead is high, it doesn't matter unless that percentage overhead eats up so much of your budget that you can't do a lot. Is that the issue?
It's sort of the issue. I mean, basically the categories that we're able to do are the ones that have a pre-existing path, that somebody has already got their institutional arrangements in order to figure out how to buy this stuff and how to put it in the ground or whatever you need to do with it. To be perfectly blunt, you would need to speak to MassDOT about what exactly they see as the challenge, and it's specifically to the highway division, because they, I think they're on the record at the MPO as saying that this is not the type of project they want to facilitate. And that there are people who would like to see it done, and certainly we've got lots of partners we've worked with on these projects, but that in the end they feel like they'd be devoting way more time on their end to it than is worthwhile.
Right. Okay. Let me digest that. And I see Franny has her hand up. I'll put my hand down and then maybe raise it again. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep.
Oh, good. So I was not able to take in everything really well because I'm in my car. But I had questions about the community connections grant, Sandy. First, two questions are, one, what is it? I start to lose sight. Like when I first got involved with the MPO and et cetera in 2005, 2006, there was this suburban mobility grants, and then there were community and mobility grants, or maybe it was vice versa. And it is the community connections grants analogous to one of those former programs or some former program, and I'm losing touch with that? That's one question.
It is a revival of those programs. There was an interlude for a number of years when those programs did not exist. I think because some members of the MPO felt like they were funding some projects that would go kaput once the MPO funding ran out, especially little shuttles and that kind of thing. And because there was limited interest, and now there's a lot more interest, so we're back.
Yeah, because they really helped us, and they helped shape our thinking in our area when we were thinking about suburban mobility. And so I'm wondering, like, what's your, when I said I couldn't concentrate completely, when you listed the types of things covered by the community connections, what's a sort of ideal type application, what do you see that program being most good for? Yeah, that's sort of.
No, that's a great question. We're still figuring it out is part of the answer. Right now, so I'll just read off the types of projects that we're accepting applications for in this round, which are automatic vehicle location systems, so GPS systems for buses, bicycle supportive infrastructure, which includes placing bike racks and expansion of bike share, bus lanes, education about transportation options, e-ink signs for MBTA bus stops. In case you haven't seen those, the MBTA has a relationship with a supplier where they put out countdown signs at bus stops. They give all kinds of information. They're solar powered, tells you how long it's going to be until the bus shows up. It's really cool. Parking management, which is leasing parking lots or to be a park and ride, or putting a new payment system in. Also, for the purposes of this program, for park and ride or transit adjacent. Transit operating projects, so new bus, shuttle, or microtransit services, and then transit signal priority projects. And in the long run, several of those categories are going to shift to the new transit modernization program, which is another program within the TIP that's going to become active in a few years. So I imagine you'll see bus lanes and TSP shift over there. I think we're seeing a lot of interest in microtransit projects. A few years ago, maybe that would have been a fixed route shuttle. Now the technology has evolved and people are more comfortable with app-based microtransit. So we're definitely seeing a lot of interest in that. Definitely just some small stuff, just putting a bike rack at a train station or a bus stop. So we love to see that. Training for seniors, for folks with disabilities, just for people on how the transit system works. That's a very cost-effective way to win over some new riders, or to help people navigate the system better. So there's not like one best type of project, but we're really trying to figure out how to get at these small interventions that are pretty lightweight and pack a big big punch for their size.
Yeah, it makes me sad that there's going to be, I mean, it's good. I know that it's competitive, but will there be a way to increase the amount of funding that goes to it? I remember seeing a chart when we were there at the transportation building where it really looked like it was, by the way, I'm not driving anymore, so I'm sitting in my driveway.
Thank you, Franny, because it always scares me when I see someone in a car and he's like, I'm going to see an accident in real time. It's like, oh.
No, I was not looking at my phone at all. It was just on there. And when I unmuted, it was just on my screen on my car. So no, I was being pretty safe. So I remember seeing the sort of breakdowns, and there was just this little thing down at the bottom. It was like 5% or something for the community connections. I can't remember what percentage of the budget it was, but
about 2%.
What is it?
2% for community
2%. And it just seems so small. So is there an opportunity with other funding programs or with increasing this for the upcoming budget? Or is there some solution for those competitive programs? Yeah. It also just always makes me sad that the communities that have resources can apply for them. But if we find something really good, like a travel training that's happening in Saugus or something, that we can then scale up and say, hey, listen, this has been really good. We spent money on this. We'd like to offer this to all these other communities. I hate for it to be just whoever manages to put in the applications. I hope that we can sort of proactively expand some of the things that people are doing in some communities.
Yeah, definitely. So that's actually a really good segue to what Matt is going to talk about next. But I will just say, from my perspective, it is up to the MPO to program what they want. If there is clearly strong demand for this program, and if MPO members and such as the advisory council and other stakeholders come to the MPO and say, hey, we'd love to see expanded funding for this, there's a chance the MPO could allocate that. There's also always a chance some programs could move around within the TIP, and more money would become available even this year. That's a possibility. We won't know for a while. So I think let's go to Len, and then we'll throw it over to Matt to talk about the TIP project universe.
Thank you. My mouse was getting a little sticky. Wouldn't go over to the unmute. Hey, so getting back to this issue with the overhead, because I understand what the issue is, but given that we picked these projects, we thought they were good projects, and now we find that the overhead is a problem. What would be the recommendation for how to get those projects done? And if it's not going to be through community connections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something we are working with MassDOT on. And I think, Len, maybe you and I should talk offline a little bit more. We're working especially closely with the Office of Transportation Planning, or OTP, to figure out, because this is something they're very interested in, not just for our MPO, but for MPOs across the state.
Okay.
And we're trying to figure out how to get it across the finish line in terms of creating a process that can work. I will say my impression is that it's very difficult for anyone at MassDOT to be very proactive right now because everybody's worried about COVID stuff.
Right.
And so I think we're in a little bit of a moment of stasis.
Sure, I get that. I get that.
But yeah, let's definitely talk about it.
Yeah, when the time is right, we can move forward. Okay, thank you, Sandy. So this really accomplished what I was hoping it would accomplish, because this was a good presentation at the board meeting. But as you know, often I have a lot of questions, and that's not the forum in which to ask a lot of questions. But this is a good forum for that. So thanks for coming and talking with us more. Appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Sandy. All right, so next up we've got Matt. We're a little bit shorter on time, but that's okay. We've had some good conversations. So Matt Genova is going to talk with us about the TIP universe for the 2022 through 26 projects. So please take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Sort of while we're getting set up here, just to add one more comment to this question about increasing funding for community connections. Sandy said we have a couple of options. Projects move around the TIP. The MPO tries to, sort of get some more funds in there because there's a desire to see these projects. But I'll just sort of reiterate that, last year having been the pilot round for this program and this year being the first open call, I think we're now sort of gathering data to bring back to the MPO to sort of make the case for the level of demand that we're seeing. I think when we started this program, 2% seemed like enough to get rolling, but not committing so much to a program that folks maybe wouldn't apply for to the level that we funded. So I think proof of concept is sort of being shown as we speak, and that can help build a case for adjusting funding levels in the future. Yeah, so exciting, and I think Sandy and I and all MPO staff are very thrilled to see the enthusiasm around the program this year. So I'm going to jump into the project universe for the TIP more broadly this year. This is the ground that I'll be covering in the presentation. So I'll start with an overview of the TIP development timeline, and we'll review some of the key decisions made by the MPO in last year's TIP. I'll talk a little bit about the project development process and then provide a high-level summary of the TIP universe. I'll conclude by going over a handful of next steps before opening it up to a discussion. So I want to note that the full TIP universe is posted to our meeting calendar under today's date. So if you want to go ahead and pull that up and have it there for reference as we talk, that'll be great. And I'm not going to go through details on specific projects in the presentation, but if you have questions on specific projects, we can always come to those in the discussion. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on the sort of TIP timeline for this year. So this is the broad TIP timeline. I know the date's not quite right on the left-hand side there, but in bold, we are talking about the TIP universe. So this was shown to the MPO a couple of weeks ago in late November. This week, along with the Community Connections Program, we have our late this week deadline for new projects to get into consideration for the TIP. So we're looking forward to seeing some more stuff come in, should folks want to apply. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on some parts of this timeline in a different way. So this is how the process is going to unfold for the TIP over the next several months. So the TIP process, like all MPO work, really kicks off with the start of the federal fiscal year on October 1st. Since then, we've been talking with all 97 communities in the region to more or less, of an extent, to confirm a main point of contact and, start discussions around project ideas. We also hosted a handful of information sessions about the TIP process. Then, like I said, I've had probably at this point more than 24 sort of one-on-one conversations with municipalities and folks in the region to talk through project ideas more specifically. So we're collecting project information right now for projects to score this year. And I do want to flag here, you'll see that the December 17th date crossed off. So originally there was a MassDOT project review committee meeting scheduled for December 17th. And this is important because all TIP projects have to be approved by the MassDOT's project review committee before we can actively consider them for TIP funding. So this date has actually been postponed until late January. And so we're still sort of in flux on trying to understand what that means for any projects that sort of wanted to sneak into the TIP pipeline this year with this last sort of round of approvals. Typically we have, at least a couple of projects jump in late in the game through this PRC meeting. So we're sort of, in a bit of a holding pattern on understanding what new projects might jump into the scoring pipeline for this year. So starting in the next week or two, we will score projects, and then we'll share those scores with the project proponents and give them a couple of weeks to look over them, provide any commentary. We really want to make sure that our project scores accurately reflect what a project is doing. And so we always have a sort of one-on-one with every project proponent to say, like, did we get this right? Is there anything else that we should be taking into account to make sure the score is accurate? So let me just jump to the latter half of the timeline here. So in early February, that's when we get updates on projects that are currently in the TIP. And so, we'll find out then if any schedules are changing, if any costs have changed. And so that will sort of set the parameters for the decisions that the MPO will make in March when we're actually, considering new projects to fund. So we'll know by that point sort of exactly how much money we have to work with and how much flexibility there is given sort of constraints placed on the new funding by existing projects that we've already committed funds to. And then, from there, we finalize a draft list of programming, and then we release the TIP for public comment. And then by the end of May, we will endorse a final TIP. And I'm sure we'll be back talking about this, at least a couple more times before all this wraps up, but just wanted to give you sort of an overview now so you know what to expect. So a brief review of the key decisions from last year. So the MPO elected to fund one complete streets project, which is the reconstruction of Woburn Common, one intersection improvement project, which is at Route 3 and Bedford Road on the border of Woburn and Burlington, and then one bicycle and pedestrian project, which is the Independence Greenway connector over Route 1 in Peabody. As Sandy talked about, last year was also the launch of the MPO's Community Connections Program. We funded 5 projects through the pilot round, transit signal priority on Concord Avenue in Cambridge and at Davis Square in Somerville, bicycle parking on the Bruce Freeman Rail Trail at the Concord Commuter Rail Station, new shuttle service in Newton, and then a marketing budget for a carpool program in Sharon. And then one other thing I wanted to remind you all of, as much as it pains me to do so, you'll probably remember that a major theme from last year was cost overruns for projects that we had already committed funding to. So these cost changes obviously, severely limited the MPO's ability to consider funding for new projects, which is why the list of projects you see here isn't a little bit longer. So that left us with a host of projects that we scored last year, but the MPO did not end up programming in the TIP due to limited funding. So those projects will come back into the conversation here in just a minute. So before we dive into the universe, I want to briefly sort of highlight the TIP project development process. to just clarify how projects actually arrive at this stage of the conversation. So this is the overall TIP project development process from ideation all the way through to construction. I'm not going to go into detail on the whole thing, but I do want to walk you through a couple of steps here at the beginning. Sorry, there we go. So every project that wants to be considered for TIP funding through the MPO really starts with twin conversations between a project proponent and both the MassDOT Highway District project development staff, as well as MPO staff. So this aligns with some of what was talked about in the RTAC meeting from last month from Carrie Lavallee at MassDOT District 6, just talking about how projects sort of get up and running in the MassDOT and MPO process, which is sort of shared here at the outset. So we really do encourage all project proponents to reach out to both parties pretty early in their sort of preliminary design process, just to talk through ideas, to confirm that the project is a good fit for seeking federal funds or specifically seeking MPO funds, in that it aligns with the MPO's priorities and fits into some of the investment programs that we've defined through the long range plan. So things like complete streets, bicycle and pedestrian improvements, etc. So assuming that a project is sort of a good fit for the TIP, sort of meeting all those baseline requirements I just talked about, project proponents can then fill out a project need form, which outlines the basic reasoning for why the project is being pursued. This process takes place through MapIt, which is MassDOT's online project initiation tool. And again, this is the tool that Mike Bolduc demonstrated at last month's RTAC meeting when he was discussing some of MassDOT's initial project scoring process. So this all happens sort of on a similar platform. So the project need form will get reviewed by MassDOT staff, and then they will approve it, assuming everything sort of looks good. And then there's a second form on the same platform called the project initiation form that gets filled out. And this form goes into a little bit more detail on how the project will address the needs that are outlined in that initial form, that project need form. A couple more steps here, just want to highlight. So again, once all this initial paperwork is completed, the project is then eligible for approval by MassDOT's project review committee. Again, this is sort of as far as a project needs to get through this approval process before we can actively consider it for MPO funds. And once this happens, once a project is PRC approved, there's a MassDOT project manager assigned to it, and the project is given sort of an official MassDOT title and project number. And those are the names and numbers that you all see when we talk about specific projects. So it sort of makes it official in both MassDOT's eyes and our eyes for the purposes of funding. And then from there, it gets us to where we are today, which means a project can sort of enter the universe of projects and be considered for funding. So with all that background in mind, I'll talk a little bit more about the universe for this TIP cycle. To create this year's TIP universe, we began with last year's universe and then removed any program projects or deactivated projects. Sort of did a little bit of house cleaning and got to a fresh list. We then added to that list with input from both municipalities as well as MassDOT staff, and just wanted to make sure that we have sort of accurately captured all the priorities that are emerging in the region for potential TIP funding. And then, as I mentioned earlier, I think we've also attended several virtual meetings with sub-regional groups and hosted some other TIP info sessions. And so this is where other project needs and ideas were discussed. So on that note, if you do have the project universe pulled up, or if you've looked at it prior to today's meeting, you'll notice that some projects on there are actually listed as pre-PRC in the design status column. So these are largely projects that we've heard about directly from municipalities and are meant to be a sort of running log of projects that may pursue TIP funding in future TIP cycles. So again, until these projects are actually approved by MassDOT's project review committee, we can't fund them, but we do keep them on this universe list just to sort of keep our finger on the pulse of what potential projects might come into the TIP process more formally. So give me just a sec here. Okay. So turning now to the TIP project universe for this year, which again, you can review on the meeting calendar. So there are two tables on the universe, which I'll draw your attention to. So the first table is the project universe, which again represents the full list of projects that are on our radar to potentially evaluate for funding this TIP cycle. The second table at the end of the document there is the list of program projects in the fiscal years 21 through 25 TIP. So those are the projects that are actively in the current TIP that is active now. So the universe is broken down by MAPC subregion and then further divided by project type. So you can see where the proposed complete streets, intersection improvement, bicycle and pedestrian, and major infrastructure projects are in each subregion. So there's also a key at the top of the table. If you've got it pulled up, projects that were evaluated last year but not funded are highlighted in green, while projects that are in the universe for the first time this year are highlighted in orange. And then projects in white were in the universe last year and remain so this year. And all of these projects are at varying stages of design, which again, you'll see in the design status column. So checking out this table here on the slide, similar to the breakdown of projects in the current TIP, you can see that more than half of the projects in the TIP universe are complete streets projects. There are also 16 intersection improvement projects and 8 bicycle and pedestrian projects in the universe, along with 11 major infrastructure projects, 3 of which are actually currently programmed in the long-range transportation plan. And across subregions, you can see there's quite a bit of variation in the number of projects included in the universe. And again, if you have questions on some specifics here, we can definitely come back to them in the conversation here in just a minute. So I wanted to provide just a little bit more context on how the current universe compares to years past. So shown here are the last 5 TIP universes. As you can see, the total number of projects in any given year has fluctuated between 100 on the high end and just under 70 on the low end. Over the last 2 years or so, MassDOT has made a significant effort to deactivate projects that were initiated several years ago and that are no longer active priorities. This has brought down the overall number of projects in the universe a little bit on average. So we're seeing a gradual downward slope here, but that is, again, very much intentional to sort of keep the universe a little bit tighter and more current with active priorities. So in short, there aren't really radical differences in the contents of the TIP universe year to year. Again, there's sort of like always some projects coming in, some projects going out, but it's not a wholesale sort of, it's not a wholesale like new list of projects by any means. Just a couple more notes and then we'll get into the discussion. So the universe is very much a working document that continues to evolve throughout the year as new projects are initiated and other projects are funded. So what you see here today is really just a snapshot in time of what's on our radar currently for TIP programming. So in fact, there have actually already been changes to the universe since it was compiled last month. There's one project that we intended on scoring this year, which is a signal project on Route 109 in Westwood. And that project is actually not going to be scored this year because the town decided to pursue municipal funding for what was a relatively low cost project. So this is sort of always in flux and we don't really get to a final list to score until the sort of last minute here. Couple more highlights on these notes. The TIP universe is pretty long. Again, it's around 70 projects this year, but we're only going to score, a handful of these projects this year. So the scoring list that we have now includes 11 projects that we scored last year, and then 1 new project that we are looking at for the first time this year. I want to highlight one note on the scoring for this year. As you all know, we recently finalized revisions to the TIP scoring criteria. So that means all projects that were scored last year but not funded will be rescored this year using the new criteria, so that all projects under consideration this year are sort of playing on the same field. And then you also notice in the universe that there aren't any community connections projects, but as Sandy just talked about, we're sourcing those through a different process. It's more of an open call for applications. And so we don't really keep a formal universe for that in the same way that we do for other TIP projects. Just a couple notes on next steps, and then we will open it up for discussion. So as I mentioned, by the end of this week or so, We're hoping to have all the information we need to start project scoring. Over the next 6 weeks or so, MPO staff will conduct that project scoring. And then, as I mentioned earlier, once we're done with the scoring, we'll send those draft scores out to project proponents, have a conversation with them to make sure we got everything right, and then bring those final scores to the MPO in late February. So with that, I'll stop there, and we can open up for a dialogue. I know that's sort of a quick run through of a lot of information, so feel free to ask about sort of anything and everything on there.
See, we have a question from David.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. And I think this in some ways dovetails well with the presentation we had sometime, I can't remember if it was last month or prior, where the MassDOT folks were talking about how they review their projects. And I asked a question of them, which is sort of like, well, how do you talk with Matt? and I was hoping to hear your thoughts, and we didn't have the time then. I wonder if you could explain that now. If a town is, or a city is looking to do something, at what point does Matt and the MPO team kick in, or is the MassDOT review committee, whatever that's called, kind of the gatekeeper of first resort, and then you come in later if they say so? How did, I mean, because I don't want to spend a lot of time over the years trying to understand MPO scoring criteria if we're not ever going to get there unless we also understand the MassDOT folks. So I need to understand how the two work together.
Yeah, definitely. It is certainly a bit of a nebulous process, so I'm happy to talk about it a little bit more. So I guess so I'll start by saying, there are certain projects that are really a better fit for MassDOT to fund because they have dedicated, funding programs for these. So things like major repaving projects that are really just resurfacing, and obviously things like bridge projects, MassDOT has really robust programs for both of these things, and the MPO doesn't really fund those. And so, that's like one sort of initial sorting process that happens is, there's certain projects that MassDOT is always going to try to fund because they have sort of an ongoing, pavement maintenance program and those sorts of things. So there is some sort of, dividing line like early in the process before a project is even, sort of formally considered by anyone. So I will say that, let's see, trying to think of the best way to start this. So I guess the project review committee is sort of a formality more than anything else. I mean, once a project makes it to that stage, like it's gone through the initiation process through MassDOT's online system, the project proponents, so usually the municipality, has already had at least a couple of conversations with MassDOT highway district staff to, sort of lay out the minimum requirements. This is what you need to provide in terms of project design, letting them know some of the minimum standards around things like bicycle and pedestrian facilities, et cetera. So in that way, like MassDOT highway district folks are really sort of polishing up some of those initial project ideas to make sure that they're at a stage where they're really ready to jump into the process. And that's why the PRC is sort of a little bit more of a formality, because typically projects don't even get to that point if they're just not going to be a good fit for MPO or MassDOT funding. And then from there, there is quite a bit of dialogue between us as MPO staff and then MassDOT staff. So with some of the folks at the highway districts, some of their planning folks, we also talk a lot with MassDOT's Office of Transportation Planning, and then with some of the program managers within MassDOT for individual funding streams, so things like the bridge program or the intersection safety program, the bicycle and pedestrian program. And so usually every year there are at least a couple of projects that municipalities have asked us to consider for funding, but that MassDOT is also considering for funding simultaneously. And so in that event, we're sort of just keeping each other in the loop as the MPO scoring process moves forward. And then MassDOT actually makes decisions usually about 3 or so weeks before the MPO does on which projects to fund. And so like last year, this happened where we scored a project on Broadway in Chelsea, but MassDOT was also looking at it for through their safety program. And then MassDOT elected to fund it. So it sort of came off of the MPO's list and it was funded by MassDOT, and then that freed up some of our funds to fund other things. And so we, there is a lot of that sort of back and forth to make sure that we each know sort of what the other party is considering and where those overlaps might be, and then that we're coordinating all the way up until those final funding decisions are made.
Yeah. So just at the risk of repeating myself, if the municipality is trying to navigate those waters, it starts off working with the review committee and relies on the interactions it has with them to know whether it's appropriate to then talk to the MPO, or does it make a separate analysis on its own about, based on the early conversations it has, and says, apparently we might want to explore things with the MPO on a parallel track because they've told us that. I mean, should the municipality have its own expertise to make that kind of a decision, or can it rely on the feedback it gets from the design review committee, project review committee?
Yeah. So let's see if I can. So your question is really about so how does a municipality approach this with sort of a clear sense of how their project will get in?
I just want to know, is it, I mean, we haven't done a project, our town hasn't in a long time, and we're trying to gear ourselves up to doing it. And okay, great. If we're going to go talk to MassDOT project review committee, that's great. But I want to make sure we're not missing some obvious route within the MPO stuff. That if a town has done it many times in recent history, that it'll be second nature to them, but we haven't. So I just try to make sure that, we're covering both bases by starting in the right place.
Definitely. So that initial conversation would really be, I mean, if you would sort of like to be considered for MPO funding, then, you could reach out to me and we can sort of start a conversation around, the project and the goals and talk about whether it's a good fit for MPO funding. And then, again, sort of MassDOT has, highway district staff who also perform a similar function there, and getting their buy-in is really important because they're the ones who are reviewing the initial project proposal. Yeah. And so so it's really about just having sort of an open dialogue early in the process between you as the proponent, us as the MPO if you'd like to be considered for MPO funds, and then also with MassDOT's highway district staff. And so I'll say, I guess one other point here, which I sort of glossed over earlier, is that typically when a municipality is bringing forward a project sort of all on their own, as in MassDOT hasn't already approached them to be like, hey, this is a priority, we want to pursue funding for something. Those are the projects that most often come to the MPO for funding, because our goal is really to help municipalities sort of solve their challenges that are too large to fund with local dollars. And so MassDOT does fund projects that are also municipal priorities, but MassDOT also has like a lot of their own project prioritization process, again, based on things like bridge condition and pavement management plans and those sorts of things that, that a lot of their funding sort of goes to things that are already on, a sort of timed lists that they're looking at. Does that make sense? I know it's
yeah, it does. Thank you. And I appreciate all your time. I don't mean to monopolize this, but we'll be in touch.
Okay. Yeah. Reach out anytime. I'm happy to talk through this more because I know
Thank you.
It's confusing. Yeah. Yeah. Franny, if you want to.
Question. It's very specific to my area of my geographic area. I'm in a group, looking at the landline out here. It was started in Littleton, and we met with David Lautzenheiser from the MAPC, who's working on mapping, and Pete Sutton of MassDOT, and we're trying to come up with signage, standard signage, and plans to connect all the communities out here for bike and ped. And so I signed up to help identify funding opportunities specifically to help with planning and outreach. Because we're right at the beginning. We're just coming up with, there's another group working on the mission. We have a new name, which is the Neshoba Regional Greenways. So I wanted to ask, I get overwhelmed with all of these funding opportunities. So it could be that we should speak after, but I thought everybody else might be interested in the idea. What is the best place between the MAPC, the MPO, this program, that program, UPWP, TIP, but whatever, to go to for funding on something like that? Help with the planning and outreach at the beginning of this process.
Yeah, so on the sort of planning and outreach, I mean, MAPC is a great resource because they have, grants for things like community outreach that the MPO doesn't really offer. And then MPO, has their own sort of technical assistance programs. And then the MPO also does have a bicycle and pedestrian technical assistance program. So that's something we can get you more information on,
okay.
For some of those early questions.
Yeah.
But then on the funding, MassDOT again has their bicycle and pedestrian program. So they've got sort of a list of projects that they're working through around the whole state.
You're talking about MPO right now?
Sorry, say again?
Were you talking about the MPO just now?
So that's MassDOT's bicycle and pedestrian program. So they put together over the last few years, like both a bicycle plan and a pedestrian plan for the state, and have identified where gaps in the network are and those sorts of things. So they use a lot of that groundwork information, and then work with the whole sort of Mass Trails team, which is a collaboration between MassDOT and DCR and EOEA.
Right. Is that Pete Sutton's program?
Yeah.
Okay. And so what? So okay.
Franny, I have a question.
Yeah.
I mean, so you're working with various towns, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so they have planning departments, don't they?
Yes, but the thing is,
wouldn't their planning departments know how to reach out and find out this information?
Yes, but we are just individuals from, like, I happen to be the chair of the transportation.
I understand, but you could connect with the planning departments for these municipalities that you're working with, right?
The weird thing is that we cross, we're both from like 2 or 3 different planning.
I understand, but you could pick one, and pick one town, in their planning department, and ask them, because they should know. And to the extent one town doesn't, then another town's planning department should know, right?
Yeah, no, that's a good idea.
Okay, cool.
Rather than just doing it from anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if this was at all an appropriate time to ask that question.
No, it's fine. No, I mean, because I was thinking it through too, and it's like, if I had this issue, where would I go? And it's like, I go to my planning department, and if you're now saying that the planning departments aren't up to speed on this, then the question is, then why aren't they? And is it that then somehow MassDOT or other entities should reach out to those planning departments and then let them know, hey, this is where you come if you need information. So it wasn't really like, oh well, Franny, you should know this. It's more like, is there a gap here between the planning departments, and MassDOT and PO and whatnot?
Yeah, no, that's a good idea. Thanks.
Yeah,
sure, no problem.
No, that's actually a great point, Len, because to apply for TIP funding, it does need to come from a municipality at a certain point. Like, we don't award funds to community groups or nonprofits or anything like that. And so so at a certain point, like, one or more of those municipalities would need to actually put forth the project.
Yeah.
So, but we can always talk more about it. I'm around, so if you have more specific questions, I'm happy to talk through that whenever.
Thanks.
Well, I know we're running late on time. I'm going to ask this one. It's just going to be brief. You can give a brief answer, Matt, because this fits in with my asking the members to read up on the needs assessment. And so I'm wondering to what extent the projects are generated by the needs assessment, meaning that the members of the MPO or whatnot go, hey, we evaluated this as part of the needs assessment, and we think it'd be good if your community did this. Or is it that the needs assessment is based on what you're hearing from the community. And so they're already thinking of projects, that would feed into the taking care of those needs and the needs assessment. Was that clear?
Yeah, yeah, and it's a really good question. Obviously, a great segue here. But so I guess the the needs assessment process does involve a lot of dialogue between us and municipalities, and so through that process, some of the needs that municipalities identify for us are more thematic in nature, like we want to improve walkability in our region or what have you. But some of those needs are pretty specific geographically and sort of lend themselves to easy translation to a tip project at some level. So a town might say like, hey, this intersection in our town center is like really dangerous. We want to enhance safety here, and that's obviously like a great need to then translate to a project. And so I mean that is really part of why we do the needs assessment, is not only to get to sort of plan out how much funding we want to spend on certain types of projects and, how we want to set our goals and objectives in the long range plan, but also to get municipalities thinking about, what do you need to help us, or what do you need from us to help solve these needs? And so, we do keep, a lot of those project ideas in our like running list of needs that we hear from folks as well. Is this for the answer you were looking for? I don't know if I covered the right ground.
It was, Matt. Thank you very much. And so, yeah, appreciate it, as always.
Yeah. And thanks, guys. And like I said, if you have other questions on specifics or, general tip things, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yeah, well, it's good to get in on the ground floor again. So that's the reason we're having you here now. It'll be, as long as I'm involved, an annual thing. So to have you here as early as possible in the process, so that we can we'll never be able to say we didn't get in as early as we could have.
Awesome.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Len.
Sure.
Thanks, Matt. So running a little late on time here, but the next thing on the agenda was Len talking about the needs assessment chapters that I think it was 1 and 2.
Yeah, I'll be really quick about this. So look, if you read them, you realize that they're very introductory. The first one is kind of like spelling out why it is they do the needs assessment and how they do it, and the second one is pretty much giving you an assessment of the demographics and the transportation system. So it may have been dry and uninteresting, but it will kick into gear in the later chapters. But the whole point is for us to really go through and understand these assessments, because it'll make us more able to talk intelligently when it comes to the tip and more so the LRTP. And so I'm asking you to try to read it. If nothing else, it's giving me incentive to read it very closely, because I read it quickly before the last LRTP, and I found it to be really valuable in just the amount of information that's presented. And so if you have questions, feel free to ask me and I can relay them, or you can go directly to the staff. But I think no question is too insignificant. The whole point is just to get us really familiar with this. So for the next month, we'll do chapters 3 and 4. And the goal is to kind of get through the needs assessment by summer. And so if anyone thinks this is a really bad idea, let me know too, and I'll take it off the agenda if there's enough people that don't want to do it. Of course, if you don't want to do it, you just don't have to do it. I'm not gonna you're not gonna be tested on it or anything. So that's it.
Yeah. So.
Len, I just have a quick comment. So I was speaking with Ann McGann, who is the manager of the LRTP, and she made a recommendation regarding this. And well, first of all, she said that she would be amenable to coming and answering any questions that people have about the needs assessment. Sorry, I had a cat in my lap that just freaked out. But she also suggested that if we're going to sort of be doing like a book club style thing with the needs assessment, to potentially focus on one goal area at a time, as the chapters are quite dense, and as you said, it can be a little bit dry, but it's a lot of information to take in. So I wasn't sure, Len, if that's in line with what you were thinking, and I just wanted to relay that message.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Actually, I mean, I feel that we really need to have exposure to all of it, and so everyone's not going to read all of it. Hopefully, most people will read most of it, but if people reading it and they only care about the things that they care about, then that's what they'll read. But as I said, I'm using this as incentive to really read that assessment very closely, because I find it so valuable in really understanding what's going on in this region. And if you understand the needs, I mean, then you can understand better, I mean, what solutions we should try to come up with to take care of those needs. I mean, but I appreciate our offer.
Okay.
All right, so Len, do you have anything for the chair's report?
I'm sorry, with 2 minutes left, I mean, and I have some background going on here. I mean, all the meetings had some interesting component. The last one, I mean, was about the big thing. It was the MBTA forging ahead, and there's going to be a capital shift to operations, and the MPO needs to sign off on that. And the other a couple meetings before, we finally wrapped up the DBDI policy, the disparate impact and the disproportionate benefits, or disproportionate disparate impacts and disproportionate effects and burdens. Thank you. Policy, and that's been a long haul, but I think the MPO did a really good job on it, and so there is a policy that was presented in that one. So in another meeting, Matt presented the TIP universe. So that's about it for the meetings.
Okay, great. So looks like the next thing that we had on the agenda was approval of the November 13th, 2019 and December 11th, 2019 minutes.
Yes. And I need to apologize here, just to quickly explain. My computer had a still slightly unknown issue where it would no longer boot up, and then have been dealing with tech support on that, and I had to get a work computer. So I had been backing up my files, but admittedly got sort of lazy partway through the pandemic. So I lost 3 sets of meeting minutes. Hopefully I'm going to get them back. I now have, my computer now starts. I just have absolutely no administrative rights, and I can't open my files or edit them. But my last discussion with Dell Tech Support said that this is a good sign. So next month will hopefully be fine, and if not, I'll just redo them. So my apologies, folks.
Okay.
Blame it on the cat. Blame it on the cat.
I'm sure it's the cat, guaranteed.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's see. Was there so other than that, was there any old business or new business? Member announcements?
All right, have a good holiday, folks. Do your best. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I guess since there's nothing, then somebody could make a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Second.
Okay, well, thanks for joining us, everybody, and have a great afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for joining.